Okay, thank you. As David said, the project was funded through a DOE technical assistance grant that we received after discussion through the Michigan Collaborative process with the Commission. Natalie Mims and I, who were offered this, had done a national look at this with 4 case studies across the country, looking at the time value of energy savings. And the request came from the Commission that, well, can you look at this in Michigan State? So we took it upon ourselves to get some money available from DOE that came through and allowed us to perform this work for the state of Michigan. So it's a follow-on work to some work that was done for 4 other locations across the country, and I'll refer to that as we go through. So let's start the process here. I can click through. First of all, I want to thank the Commission staff and consumers and DTE staff, and particularly Rick Morgan, who helped us a lot gather the information, interpret the information, make sure we were reading the data correctly. So a lot of interchange back and forth with both utility and Rick and the Commission staff to make sure we were reading the information and interpreting it correctly. So we appreciate all the effort that went into that. Before we start doing anything, we have to have the data and understand it. So I'll talk about first the study approach and then get into the results. The purpose of the study was to document the time-varying value of energy efficiency measures, particularly to look at their capacity or demand impacts. The 5 measures we looked at were an exit sign. That's sort of an example of a flat load shape. The reason we selected the flat load shape is it's the same in all locations. So it's only the value of the energy and the capacity benefits, so you can compare across locations. So there's no variation in the way energy is used. It's one. If there's 87 kilowatt hours in a year, consumption is 1 kilowatt hour or 1 kW per hour in every location. So that load shape is a way to normalize across locations that you're looking at. The other 4 load shapes can be location specific. They may or may not be, depending on the weather and lots of other conditions. Residential lighting and water heating. We picked residential lighting because it's a pretty ubiquitous program. Most utilities run it, so they have lots of savings in that basket. Same way with residential water heating and residential air conditioning and commercial lighting. We were using only publicly available data on avoided cost, and in this case we used a combination of hourly avoided cost and coincidence factors derived from 3 different sources. The first was the DS Moore program model, hourly load shapes and coincidence factors that we derived from DS Moore. We'll talk more about the value of doing that in a moment. DS Moore hourly load shapes and coincidence factors derived from the Michigan Energy Measures database, and we used that as in the end. And we also compared that to hourly load shapes from meter data or building simulations. The intent was to compare one of the intents was to compare the Michigan values to the values we derived from other locations in the prior study that I mentioned. So, going back to the methodology in a general sense, the first thing we did, we needed a system load shape so we could derive knowing when the peak value would be. So that information was provided by the utilities, and we combined the consumer's energy and DTE load shapes to get a combination load shape. So this load shape that we're looking at today is the average of the 2, so it's not reflective of either individual utility. That's true of all the energy cost and capacity as well. So the public information is a combination of the two weighted somehow together. We don't know specifically how it was done. It could be 50-50, could be 70-30, whatever. So it's basically masked in that regard. The DS Moore load shapes and a 15-year forecast of avoided cost by hour, and that was provided through Rick's auspices by getting information from the utilities. Coincidence factors from the Michigan Energy Database. They gave us, in addition to the avoided cost of energy per hour, we had capacity avoided cost, transmission, distribution avoided cost, and ancillary service values, and that was all those were used to calculate the value of capacity. The hourly load shapes were work that was derived from metered studies in the Northwest for three residential uses, water heating, lighting, and commercial lighting. In the end, we also looked at the residential air conditioning load shape from the Northwest. The Building America simulations are part of the program that operates through the Department of Energy. They are system simulations, house simulations for locations in the state of Michigan. We looked at those absent specific meter data on residential air conditioning for the state. So the inputs, first we'll look at is the system load shape. We'll bring these up one at a time, but before I do that, across the bottom you'll see month, and across the vertical axis you'll see percent of peak month load. So what this plot does is, on a month-to-month basis, it says when was the peak load for the year, and then what percent of each month the peak load is it as a percent of the total or the maximum in the year. So for the Pacific Northwest, as an example, you start near 100% in January and December. It's a winter peaking system. It goes back up in June, July, and August to something like 95% of its winter peak. So it basically has a double hump, although the maximum demand is in winter. If we go to the next location, California, is the red line, Massachusetts is the green line, Georgia is the light amber line, I guess, or purple line, and the combination consumers and DTE is the solid dark red line. You see it peaks in July and August, close to 99 to 100%. August looks like the peak month, and so the maximum demand on the system is during the summer months, much like four of the other locations we looked at, or three of the other locations we looked at, California, Massachusetts, and Georgia, with the Pacific Northwest having a pronounced winter peak compared to a summer peak. So what's important is that summer month peak, because that's what's driving both the cost of and need for new expansion resources as loads grow, as peak loads grow. If we look at a summer day for individual end uses, across the bottom we have hours of the day. Those are hours ending. So 1 is 1 a.m. and 24 is midnight. We have, again, percent of peak hour load. So this is like the first one, only it's on an hourly basis as opposed to a monthly basis. And each hour, back here, there we go. The first load shape up is residential lighting, and the dark line is the system load shape for consumers and DTE on a typical summer day. So as you can see, the load peaks in the middle of the afternoon, late afternoon, around hour 17. That's when air conditioning and other loads are at their maximum. If you look at residential lighting in the summer, it comes on later because there's more daylight hours, and it comes on around hour 19 and shuts off around hour 23, 11 o'clock or so. And as a consequence, its peak demand is not consistent or coincident, as we call it, with the demand for the system itself. So while it contributes to peak, it's not straight on peak. If you look at residential air conditioning and hot water, they're closer to the system peak, although they build during the day. If you look at commercial lighting, that's the next one up. It's purple. It's a big block. It's basically consistent with business hours, and so its peak demand is through the most of the day. It tends to fall off after business hours, and as a consequence, it misses a portion of the system peak. And the exit sign, which is across the bottom, or across the top, is on all the time. So you can't really see it. It's a line that goes at 100% all the time because it's the same every hour of the day. If we look at a winter day, which is the next chart, you can see there's kind of a double hump: morning warm-up and afternoon and evening lighting. The peak is later in the day, around hour 20. That's, again, the system peak. Much more coincident with both residential lighting and water heating as people come home. So those tend to be driving the evening peak in the winter because it's dark by the time folks get home. And again, both the exit sign and the commercial lighting, the exit sign is 100% all the time. The exit sign peaks starting around the beginning of the business hours and ends at the end of the business hours around hour 16, roughly 5 o'clock, so 5 to 6 o'clock. So you don't see it contributing. Its maximum demand is not coincident with the system maximum demand. So if we look at other inputs, building to the input deck to the analysis, these were provided by the utilities and RIC. Discount rate 3.88%. That's a real discount rate net of inflation. We normalized every measure to an expected life of 15 years. That may or may not be true for individual measures, but in order to make sure that they were consistently treated across everything and we didn't have measure life interfering with the comparisons, we normalized all measures to 15 years. We also assumed that each measure or group of measures would produce 1,000 kilowatt hours or 1 megawatt hour per year of savings. System losses were assumed a little over 7%. The levelized avoided energy costs, again, varied by load shape since it's price per hour. The capacity cost was $71.50, and avoided transmission and distribution costs combined were about $80 a kilowatt year. Ancillary service costs a little over $3 a year. 4 other inputs that we had from other locations, the avoided carbon emissions cost. When we looked at New England, and California, they have a carbon trading program in place, and so there was an avoided cost for CO2. In other locations, people have inserted an avoided cost for carbon, social cost of carbon, in some cases as a proxy for internalizing those costs of electricity production. In some cases, there is the avoided cost of renewable portfolio standards. In this case, it was assumed to be 0 based on input from the state and from the utilities. In New England, they incorporate the demand reduction induced price effect, which basically says if you reduce demand at peak in an organized market, there's a potential for reducing the market clearing price because demand and supply intersect at a lower level. And so there's some value for reducing demand that gets shared by everybody. In this case, it was assumed to be 0, and avoided risk were also assumed to be 0. So while those were values that had some non-zero, or those were parameters that had some non-zero value in other locations, they are assumed to be 0 here in Michigan. Inputs on coincident peak capacity reduction. We have 3 measures here: residential lighting, water heating, and the exit sign. This is a comparison chart that shows what's in the measure database from Michigan. The coincidence factor is the percent of peak load of an end use that actually occurs coincident with the system peak load. So in the case of residential lighting, the Michigan Energy Database shows that roughly 10% of the peak load of residential lighting occurs, of the maximum load of residential lighting occurs at the same time that the system peak occurs. Water heating, that's 71%, and exit sign, because it's on every hour, 100%. And as you go across, we take that and take the 1,000 kilowatt hours a year or the 1 megawatt hour a year and show how much megawatt demand, what fraction of megawatt demand is non-coincident. So on 1,000, the maximum demand on residential lighting is 0.98 or 980 kilowatts of lighting on at system peak, or not on at system peak, but only 10% of that is coincident with the system peak. So as I showed in the first chart, the residential lighting load in the measured database shows that only 10% of it appears in the summer system peak. That's different in the winter, but in the summer, it's less than that. When you look at the meter data under the Pacific Northwest case, the coincidence factor is different, but the shape is different, and as a consequence, there's not a great deal of difference in the coincident peak, which is megawatts per megawatt hour, which is about 0.8 of a megawatt, or 80 watts in this case, instead of 0.98. So there's a 0.098. So there's a little bit of difference there. If you look at the other measures, exit sign is basically the same, and residential water heating, it's about half with the meter data compared to the residential water heating in the coincidence factor in the measured database. So you need to look at both the coincidence factor and the energy resultant from that to see whether there's going to be a significant difference in the value depending on which load shape you use. The next slide up shows the same information for multiple end uses. When we look at the coincidence factor for residential air conditioning in particular, it's pretty different between the measure database and the coincidence factor for the Pacific Northwest meter data. The coincidence factor for the meter data is lower than the coincidence factor coming out of the measure database, and that means the kilowatt hour benefit, however, is much higher in the Northwest database than it is in the meter database, because the shape that's underlying that places less coincident load on the system in the measure database than it does in the Northwest. You see a 0.54 is the coincident peak reduction. In the Northwest, the number is somewhere between 0.83 and as high as 2.5 in the building simulation, which are lines second and third line. Residential air conditioning Lansing and residential air conditioning Detroit are both simulated data. The residential central air conditioning RBSA and residential central air conditioning LCAP are both metered data. Again, there's a difference between what's in the meter database and what's in the Michigan Energy database. We look down at commercial lighting. The numbers for the energy database, measure energy database, 0.49 coincidence factor, that comports really well with the commercial office lighting from LCAP, which was a study done in the late 80s, early 90s in the Northwest that measured office space lighting load shapes. It's a little bit lower than the value that comes from the California Energy Commission, DEC line of commercial office, which is 0.76. But when you look over at the actual absolute value of the peak load reduction, which is 0.18 when you look at the measure database, Michigan Energy database, it's somewhere between the 0.14 and the 0.22 that you get from the meter data. So all things considered, not all that different with respect to the metered and what's in the MEMD.
Tom, this is Rick.
Yeah, Rick.
Can you discuss just a minute which ones of these are the modeling and are you going to discuss the issues with modeling?
Yeah, the modeling in this case, thank you for bringing that up. The modeling for residential air conditioning shows the second and the third line, the one that is labeled residential central air conditioning Lansing and residential central air conditioning Detroit, and also the commercial office lighting CEC. Those are all modeled load shapes based on simulation models with hourly inputs for scheduling, I suspect, in the case of lighting, and with local weather conditions for Lansing and Detroit using Energy Plus in case of the residential air conditioning models. And we've had a long discussion as we pursued this. The residential air conditioning I'll talk a little bit more about as we go. But suffice it to say at this point, you can see that it has substantially higher, the modeling reveals substantially higher megawatts of capacity reduction than does either the metered data or the measure energy database. And to put a spoiler out there, we think this is largely due to the fact that you're simulating one building at a time with no diversity across houses. And if you actually simulated 1,000 homes with occupants in varying locations across the city with varying temperature set points and behavior, you wouldn't get as much peak reduction, but you're looking at one house at a time as opposed to the diversified consumption of residential air conditioning. And that is a problem for using simulation models to generate the coincidence factors that you might get, because you don't have the underlying diversity of occupancy behavior that's really driving the load shape in many cases, particularly for things like air conditioning and lighting, for that matter, based on how many switches are in the building at a time. So we'll come back to that as we look at the more downstream results. This is a very busy page. You can inspect it at your will. I won't spend a lot of time. This is basically summarizes where we got the data and the coincidence factors that were used and the peak capacity reduction that was generated using those. It's in the report that we provided. It's an eye strain to look at it here, so we'll just move on. This gets to the point of comparing a couple end uses between the metered and the DS Moore load shapes, and a discussion that we had with everybody as we pursued this about which one is more reflective of what actually goes on in buildings. So this is the metered load shape for residential water heating in the Northwest. This is the load shape along with the system peak line there that we had from the DTE and Consumers Energy load shapes. And you can see there's quite a bit of difference in what we would estimate the peak impact to be between the two load shapes. So in the case of the DS Moore load shape, it would show for residential water heating substantially greater peak reduction using that load shape. Now this is not what we used, but if you use the DS Moore load shape, it's one of the reasons why we didn't use it. We used the coincidence factor from the Michigan Energy Database, which is different than this. But if you use the DS Moore load shape relative to the metered load shape, you'd say that there was a lot more peak coincidence savings from a water heating measure than you would get if you use the metered load shape. And so you would overstate, in this case, if you believe the metered data, overstate the peak impacts of saving a kilowatt hour or a kW in the case of water heating.
Rick, sorry, let me just clarify that the DS Moore load shape is not that's shown, since we don't have a residential water heating end-use load shape to use. We use the customers at the meter load shape. So that shape reflects the customer's load at the meter, just so everybody knows that it's not a specific water heating load shape, because we don't have that.
Right, and it is, as we talked with Rick and utility staff, it is one of the reasons why we went to the Michigan Energy Measure database for the coincidence factor rather than using the load shape, using the coincidence factor derived from DS Moore, because it's less accurately representational of the load shape we're interested in. So this is to illustrate, simply to illustrate that there are, without the specific end-use load shapes, you can place yourself in jeopardy with respect to understanding the real capacity impacts. If we look at another measure, residential lighting, again, the DS Moore load shape shows a difference in impact relative to the actual load shape from measured data from the Northwest, which is at a similar latitude, so it gets dark about the same time during the winter and as it does in Michigan, and it gets light about the same time. So the difference in peak impact there is fairly significant because the DS Moore load shape assumes that the lighting is on 3 hours a day, starting at roughly hour 19, 7 p.m. or 7 or 8 p.m. and turns off around 11 or so, 10 to 11. Whereas in the case of the metered load shape, you see a little bit of lighting in the morning, kicking on, and then ramping up, and then shutting off more like basically at the same time, but over a longer, a little gentler slope. As a consequence, the DS Moore load shape maybe has the right energy component to it in terms of 3 hours a day, but it's distributed differently, and the capacity effects would be different on a summer peak day than you would estimate from. You'd actually get some lighting benefit, whereas the DS Moore load shape would show you very little, if any, capacity effect on peak. Once again, we didn't use the DS Moore load shape to do capacity. We used the measure database. But again, it's the intent to show that one needs to make sure you've inspected the underlying data before the calculation gets done. Let's look at commercial lighting. In this case, there's a lot less difference. It's just offset an hour or two, but you still see some difference in impact. It's the hat shape that's in DS Moore is stylized from the actual load shape that you get from meter data. It doesn't go down. Lights don't go completely off in the commercial building, apparently, on average, overnight, as you would see in DS Moore. So you get some evening and afternoon savings in energy and capacity that wouldn't show up if you used the DS Moore load shape. Again, we didn't use this, but it's illustrative of being conscious of what the underlying data looks like before you do the math. We've got this next chart shows simulated residential air conditioning. This is a point that we want to make from that Rick brought up earlier, simulated versus measured. The red line is, as Rick said, the building load shape for residential air conditioning that's used to represent residential air conditioning in DS Moore, but as he said, is not really residential air conditioning load shape. It's the whole premise load shape, and so it has consumption higher in the morning hours than you would get if you looked at, in the case of the second line there, which has the triangles on it, the labeled PNW RBSA metered load shape, which is air conditioning in the Northwest, which is much lower in the morning hours, overnight hours, and then picks up in the afternoon as the day and the humidity increases. So we've got a difference in morning load shape, but coming on basically peaking at roughly the same time. These are the purple line that I just added is the LCAP metered load shape. Then we have some simulated load shapes from, well, actually the next one is metered upper Midwest load shape that we get out of the EPRI database, which is the lighter blue line with squares on it. And it shows, again, overnight consumption, much higher overnight consumption, well, not much higher, but significantly higher than the LCAP data and a little bit higher than the RBSA meter data. And I suspect it's probably more representative than either the meter data for the Northwest, either of the two metered studies for the Northwest, because air conditioning is on longer during the overnight hours in the Midwest than it is in the Northwest because the humidity is higher overnight, and air conditioning is operating in dehumidification mode as opposed to just cooling mode. So you've got some overnight consumption that's higher, and the shape from EPRI may be more representative for Michigan than are the LCAP data because of that. It's drier in the Northwest, it cools down at night, and so air conditioning tends to shut down overnight and pick up during the day. If you look at the next two, let me add those and then I'll stop. The next two are the simulated data from for Lansing and Detroit, and they're much peakier, and that was a problem we recognized as we were starting to use the simulated data, that they didn't have the diversity. They were too peaky at the top relative to what was measured. So I'll stop there. Was that you, Rick?
Yes. let me just clarify a couple things about the DS More for everybody. DS More also uses the MEMD peak information, coincident peak information in its calculation. So while you'll see this load shape that Tom illustrated and showed, that's for the kilowatt hours just allocation. The KW is calculated for the financials using the MEMD coincident peak number. So the model itself financially uses that coincident peak value to give you the KW that happens on coincident peak based on the MEMD value. And the other piece, just to clarify, within the MEMD, the air conditioning values are simulated and modeled as well to create the peak values and the other things that go into the MEMD. So while we have the load shape that he's showing here with the air conditioning, we still would have the peak value in the MEMD, which I think is where Tom's going to move to next. But I just want to clarify for everybody how DS More works.
Yeah, and we used the MEMD coincidence factors and peak savings values from the database as well, because that's, Rick pointed out, that that's how DS More does it. It generates the energy savings from the load shape, the kilowatt hour benefit by hour from the DS More load shape, but the capacity benefits are all derived from the Michigan Energy Measure database. So again, just to reiterate, the simulated residential end uses tended to be too peaky, and they were generating substantially higher benefits for capacity savings than either the measured database or the MEMD database, and so they are an overstatement of the capacity benefits because they lack the diversity of occupant behavior driven changes in when air conditioning comes on, the cooling temperature that the air conditioning is set, and the diversity of housing stock that's out there, and the efficiency of air conditioning in that housing stock. So measured or somehow diversified simulated information needs to be provided when you're dealing with load shapes. So next slide sort of rolls it all up. This is a chart that shows for the locations and for the various databases that we used by load shape. Each one of those is a load shape value. It is the ratio of the time-varying value of the total time-varying value of a measure to its energy value only. So it's basically, if I add all the energy value and capacity value, that's the total size of that chart divided by the energy. So it's the ratio of the two, energy only value to capacity plus energy. And if you look at the tallest bars, the green bar in California, Massachusetts, Georgia, and all of the cases for Michigan, the tallest bar is residential air conditioning. And it has, because it is more coincident with the peak demand, its capacity value benefits of savings add significantly to its energy value of savings. And that's why its ratios are somewhere between 2 and 3 times the value, that is, its capacity value is somewhere 2 or 3 times its energy value. So it's a huge benefit on the capacity side as well as the underlying energy benefit. In the Northwest, which is the odd one out, it has a value relative to energy of 1, meaning it has no capacity value because it's a winter peaking system, and saving kilowatts in the summer don't offset the need for new generation because the need for new generation is driven by winter heating and water heating loads and lighting loads. And so its energy to capacity value is basically the same, 1. You can see, depending on the data set used, which are the 3 sets of bars to the right, the DS More coincidence factors, the DS More with MEM database coincidence factors, and the DS the consumers energy DTE energy values with meter data, the answer is about the same across there. There's a little bit of difference with the MEM database coincidence factors. The principal difference is that for the residential lighting and commercial lighting, there's no diversity in the DS-Moore load shape, so that the CE/DTE DS-Moore coincidence factors, those are there for illustrative purposes only. We don't necessarily think that they are correct because that's not the way Rick does it with DS-Moore. He uses the central bar there, the DS-Moore with MEM coincidence factors. And so those are the ones that one can look at. And again, it shows residential air conditioning as the peak value, commercial lighting a little closer to that. It's got higher values, and the lowest one being a residential lighting because it's not a peak constant measure in the summer months. It comes on later in the day. So the bottom line here is the relative relationship in Michigan doesn't look all that different than in the other places where we have summer peaking utility representation, which is California, Massachusetts, and Georgia. I'm going to stack these all. Oops. This is just looking at the total value DS-Moore load shapes with the MEM coincidence. This is looking specifically at the input assumptions and what's driving the size of those bars. Along the right-hand side, you see the avoided cost values. Some cases, as I said, they were 0. But you can see there's a big component. There's a $100 value, roughly a little better than a $100 value for residential air conditioning because it comes on during the summer months when prices are higher in the market and costs of generation are higher. It's a bigger component than residential lighting or commercial lighting. But there's also a big build on for capacity, the big purple area up there, and transmission distribution adder. And those are what really, those values are what really drive the capacity because we're expanding the infrastructure for transmission and distribution on peak, and the market cost for capacity is higher for that particular measure. So it's in terms of overall value to the system, a much more valuable economic measure than is the flat load or other measures. Not that they're unimportant, but residential air conditioning has a sizably greater benefit to the utility system than do the other measures, almost 2 to 1. If we look at the metered load shift, you get pretty much the same answer with even more pronounced benefits for commercial lighting, commercial air conditioning, residential air conditioning. This is the metered data with metered load shifts with coincidence factors derived from those. But it's the same relative order except for a couple of measures. There's a switch. If you look in the prior chart and this chart, in some of the relative order, residential lighting, commercial lighting, water heating, flat stays the same. Some of those have different values, and this is not necessarily based on their capacity, but mostly based on when the energy is saved. And I'll show you a couple of charts following as to why that is. If you look at the load shape of commercial lighting, if you use the DS-Moore load shape, all the energy is saved during those hours between 7 and 16. If you look at the measured load shape, the energy is saved both during the evening and the off-peak hours in the afternoon, and you get a load shape that's not all, or an energy value that's not all that different, $62 a megawatt hour in aggregate versus 61. So those load shapes are very comparative relative to the average energy value. They produce pretty much the same annual energy benefit. A dollar difference is negligible with respect to what we know about future avoided costs. So they're basically the same number. So that's a really good match between the DS-Moore representation of commercial lighting and what was measured in the Northwest for commercial lighting. Did I hear a question, Rick or somebody? No? All right. On the other hand, if we look at residential lighting, you've got the red chunk here, which is the DS Moore load shape representation, and the blue chunk, which is representation of the meter data. And if you integrate the energy value there, you get different results. You get, for metered load shape for annual energy savings, you get $56 a megawatt hour, but $75 a megawatt hour for the DS Moore load shape.
I'll have to turn that off. All right.
Okay. And so it's not only that the coincidence factor matters, but the shape of the energy consumption over the course of the day also matters, because the price of the energy varies during the day and during the year. And so you can get a mismatch, either under or overstatement of the value of the energy savings, as well as an understatement or overstatement of the value of capacity savings, if the load shape isn't accurately representing what's actually going on in the field. So not arguing which one of these is correct, it's just they are definitely different. If you look at the same thing that happens when you get residential air conditioning, as Rick said, the DS Moore load shape represents the whole premise load shape for residential air conditioning, whereas the metered load shape for air conditioning quite different, doesn't have as much overnight consumption, and as a consequence you get an energy value, not a capacity value, of $127 a megawatt hour for the energy in the case of the metered load shape, and only $108 in the case of the DS Moore load shape. There's probably a middle point someplace in there, because the energy consumption for air conditioning is higher in the off-peak hours in Michigan than it actually is in a metered load shape in the Northwest. But it gives you an indication of, that you've got to be careful that you distribute the energy as well as the capacity in a way that actually represents the measure's load shape. Otherwise, you'll get an aggregate value of energy and capacity that's got a mismatch with what the actual value of that measure for load shape might be. So just to give you some magnitude here, this is using the DS Moore load shape with the MEM coincidence factor versus the metered load shape for residential lighting. You can see that the yellow component of that stack of benefits is sizably different between the metered load shape and the DS Moore load shape, because the lighting energy savings are priced at the hourly level differently, because the hours over which the lighting is assumed to occur is different in one case versus the other. So it's important to get both energy and capacity benefits correct. Here's the problem with central air conditioning. When you look at the thing that Rick brought up earlier, the last bar stacked over to the right is a simulated bar, and you can see it is sizably larger and incorrect because it's simulated. It doesn't have the diversity in it, and you see air conditioning being $5,000 or $500 a megawatt hour benefit in aggregate, with a huge benefit for capacity for generating and transmission offsets. Not a lot of difference for energy, but because it lacks the diversity, it's saying there's a whole lot more peak savings than you actually would get if you looked at either the meter data or the measure energy database coincidence factors. They're in the range of $200 to $250 versus double that. So the error band around the meter data versus the MEM database is pretty small relative to the almost factor 2 error you get by using the simulated data. All right, so let's go to conclusions, and then we'll take whatever questions you might have. Our basic assessment was that the total energy value for energy savings in Michigan aligns pretty well with the information we derived by looking at the other 4 locations, the Northwest, California, Georgia, and Massachusetts. The end-use shape, end-use load research for Michigan, it would be good if we could get more accurate load shapes for Michigan using some meter data. I think it would improve the accuracy of the time-varying value of efficiency assessments in the state. Michigan is not alone there in our work nationally. There's, at least in terms of publicly available data, a real limited data set of end-use load shapes, particularly in the commercial sector, but also in the residential sector beyond maybe space heating or cooling. And once you get past that, it's pretty limited. So, our conclusion would be if Michigan was to derive a statistically valid sample of end-use load shapes, it would certainly improve the analysis of the benefits of time value of energy savings, and for that matter, any other measure that you're going to look at the time varying value for. So I would throw into that demand response, distributed generation, and any other measure you might undertake if you want to do a proper avoided cost evaluation, because it varies by time. The DS Moore load shapes may over or understate, hard to say, without actual having the metered data for the state to know what they are. Either energy or capacity, or it's hard to say which, but it looks like from our analysis that DS Moore load shape, particularly for residential air conditioning, because it uses whole premise, probably has a different statement of value than would using the actual air conditioning load shape. And I think that's also true for water heating, which I didn't show, but it's basically the same issue. So because we can't compare these to metered load shapes for Michigan, we can't say whether the error is either an overstatement or understatement. It would be good to answer that question, and in order to do that, you need some meter data to make that happen. We found that the substitution of simulation data in particular was not a good methodological approach unless that simulation data can be represented somehow to include the diversity of either occupant behavior or housing stock behavior or commercial building behavior. It was too driven by schedules and or too idealized, so it tends to be tends to overstate the actual peak benefits, and may distribute the hours of use too precisely relative to what actual diversity is in the field. As I said in the beginning, the time value of energy in the case of Michigan, we did not include any value for dry RPS, carbon, or risk. It's probably worth considering, at least for risk and for carbon, whether the state ought to think about what those values might be. That's a state policy matter and an investigation consideration of those, given if the state has carbon offset goals or carbon reduction goals, and whether there are risk assessments that need to be done as a consequence of that. One might consider that on a going forward basis. That's a policy determination that the state ought to take on and consider and decide. Not our recommendation, but it's zero value may or may not be appropriate for some of those, particularly for DRIPE and air emissions and risk. I think the last bullet there gives you some sense of what the magnitude of those other factors might add to the total. Those are purely illustrative from other states, but it gives you some indication that they're non-zero values and some idea about their size. In the case of risk mitigation, it might add 3 to 5% in terms of benefit. If we look at other locations, DRIPE looks to be around a 5% adder from other locations. And depending on the price of carbon, it can be 6 to 13%, and as high as 50% adder in the Northwest if you go all the way to the social cost of carbon. So I think that's conclusions number 3 and where we ended. And this is the author's contact information if you want to get a hold of us. And I'll stop there and open it for questions. We can also take questions via email if at some later date, if you've got a chance to read through the document and have further questions, Natalie or I would be glad to answer some of those. Lisa Swartz, who was our boss, helped edit the paper to make sure it spelled everything correctly and was clear. So I want to say we appreciate that. So, questions from you folks, if any?
This is Douglas Jester. I have one question. Hi, Tom.
Hi, Doug.
Would you confirm that this analysis is based only on the direct energy use of the modeled devices and doesn't deal with, for example, the cooling load resulting from other, lighting, hot water, etc., and then the consequent air conditioning load?
Right. Well, yes and no. We assumed 1,000 kilowatt hours a year worth of savings, 1 megawatt hour. However, you might want to represent the derivation of that from the measure you actually installed. We tried to avoid deriving the actual savings themselves because we wanted to just compare the same quantity of savings but with different load shapes. So if it could be 1,000 kilowatt hours with interactive effects accounted for, it could be 1,000 kilowatt hours without interactive effects accounted for. So I don't want to say it was any more than 1,000 kilowatt hours. That we just use that value.
And I always throw this in that when you refer to Michigan, this would represent Michigan's lower peninsula, not necessarily Michigan's upper peninsula because the UP is winter peaking.
Yes, this is simply representation of the values we got for consumers and DTE. It's not. It's specific to their service territories, and again, it's the aggregate of their avoided cost, not their individual avoided cost. It was what we were given to represent them as a group of two utilities and no other utilities, so specific to that. It does use the Michigan Energy Database. That's a statewide database, but specific for specific locations in those two service territories.
So do we have any other questions in the room, or? Thank you very much, Tom. So consumers and DTE obviously have been participants in this study, so it's good to share it with the rest of the group. But what does consumers or DTE think about the results of this? It seems useful, and it seems like there's an indication that if we could tackle some of the recommendations that have improved the upcoming IRP processes and improve energy efficiency and DR's standings in the when you're running models and things. But what is your take on this?
From a DT perspective, we're also looking at other load shapes using some other data sources such as EPRI, specifically to this data, and then we'll see what that looks like compared to this data. IRP, which we're getting ready to do.
Joe, are you on?
Yeah. From the consumer's energy standpoint, no, we thought the findings were interesting. The big challenge is doing the more granular analysis. We're starting to get that data, but doing load shapes for a particular, at a kind of a mass scale, is requires some fairly significant research. And so, given the studies the calibration studies that we already have underway, that's going to be the short-term challenge. But I think long-term, we'll certainly be able to, we certainly should look at this as an opportunity for making sure we're understanding the full value of the time value of electricity and savings.
Tom, are you aware of next steps that other parts of the country have taken after viewing things like this?
I think there's a growing interest, because technology is advancing with respect to metering and reducing its cost and allowing you to collect the information at a lower cost with advanced metering infrastructure and other techniques. There seems to be a growing interest in getting a better handle on the load shape effects of energy efficiency, demand response, and distributed generation. That's going to change what the utility sees as a net load, and will need to supply in some cases. Whether you've got distributed generation or EE or DR affecting that. One of the things that we point out in the original paper was that many measures on a going forward basis will be derived through changing the load shape, because they'll be implementing controls, things like occupancy sensors, daylight sensing, lighting controls, variable speed drives on motors and other equipment, variable refrigerant flow, air conditioning that has a load shape that may or may not look like the underlying load shape we had to begin with, lighting load shapes that are now driven by controls as opposed to just improving the wattage of the fixtures, lowering the wattage of the fixtures. So there's a growing interest in a better understanding of what will present as a load to the utility system after the impact of either utility-driven activities, energy efficiency, demand response, or consumer adoption of distributed generation or electric vehicles. And I think it's on a going forward basis a system that's going to get more complex as opposed to less complex in terms of understanding the role that utilities have to play in supplying a consumer's energy on an hourly or sub-hourly basis. So there's some work to be done there, and we're beginning to see activity in that area. The Northwest is redoing the study of residential load shapes over a 5-year period. I believe New England is also undertaking like a 5-hard home and use load shape research study. California is doing similar kinds of work in the residential commercial sector. So you see other areas of the country starting to pick this up as an issue.
So it seems like it could be an incredible amount of work, but is there any indication of certain measures or uses that have a high probability of needing correcting or that kind of thing to do some pilot work?
Well, certainly, if you look at the size of the bar for residential air conditioning, you want to get a better fix on that pretty soon, I think, to get that tied down. If you have, I would say, this is a judgment call on my basis, not without inspecting Michigan specifically, but if you've got demand response programs, and I know residential water heating is a favored one because it's been around for years. you want to make sure you're getting the capacity benefits of that one correct as well if you're going to use it for capacity offsets. So estimating what you're really getting on a planning basis may be different than what you're getting in the field when you turn those off. And so I think, getting a better fix on the water heating load shape would be good, or any load shape you intend to implement a demand response type program on, so you get the capacity benefits you expect. So that it's either, that's, you're trying to make sure you've got some reliable estimates there. So that would be my go-to, but I don't have any greater insight than that at this point for Michigan specifically.
I don't remember much talk about water heating demand response programs.
In our area, it's very low.
Is there any other questions from the callers or in the room?
This is Joe Persol again. I would just echo what John, I think that was John said from DTE, is that the water heater penetration appears to be fairly low in our area. The electric water heater penetration seems to be fairly low. We're getting some new research on that to update some estimates, but I think air conditioning is going to be the more promising of those two categories in terms of potentially getting additional savings or correcting, fully accounting for savings. So that's probably a higher priority. That probably would make more sense as a higher priority in Michigan.
Yeah, you guys have a better sense of where your meat is than I do, so.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tom and Rick. And a couple of weeks ago, I think I sent out a link to the paper as well. If anybody has any further questions, please follow up.
Well, thank you all, and again, thank Rick and the utilities for all the patience and input, clarity, and effort they put into it. So couldn't do it without you guys.
Thanks, Tom.
All right.